So we wanted to talk about some options that you have in regards to retouching that may help you if your image has a lot of noise or paper texture. So before you get into a lot of these damages, it is going to be very useful for you to be able to zoom in and look and see what type of damages are there, but also what type of noise and things that may influence how well you can retouch the photos. So this is an image that has visible paper texture. And this paper texture may actually make it harder for you to retouch. And so when you're using some of those retouching tools like we've learned, such as the clone stamp, you may actually notice that when you start to retouch that it repeats some of that paper texture. So the more that we can soften that texture or the noise in a photo, if it's visible, it might possibly help retouching. So what we're going to do is just talk through just a couple options. Most of these options actually do some sort of filter that will essentially soften or blur the photo just a little bit. So you do want to make sure you're paying very close attention and maybe even zooming in really close to the details, because you don't want to push these too far. So we're going to go up to filters and we will get into just a few different ones that we have options. So the first one that I'll show you is the surface blur. And the surface blur is literally a very soft blur that's going to be applied to this photo. And when you have this option, you'll see that you have different preferences here that you can change. So the radius, the larger that number, the more it's going to blur it. And then the threshold obviously is going to do something similar. So you should start to notice that it has softened the photo somewhat. So just keep in mind that this does change your image. You are welcome to try smart filters so that it does not affect the entire image. However, sometimes they do want you to commit to those before you can actually retouch your image. So usually a lot of the times we will still apply them to this photo. So and we can push it and you can see the difference, like that's way too far and this is just a tad bit. So it may soften it just enough for you to be able to retouch without those pixels repeating. You'll have to judge which one works better for you. So that's one example. We'll cancel out of there and you see that difference. It goes back to being a little bit more crisp and clear. The next one is it is under noise and we have the option to despeckle, to use dust and scratches, and then median is the other one that's popular. And they're all very similar. They're just going to be just a slight like softening of your actual image. And that actually doesn't give you preferences for the one that I just applied. So when you do go into noise and say despeckle, it's like a really quick, and I'll do it one more time, change to the photo that's very soft. That may soften it just enough. I know it's very annoying when you have paper texture like this. The reason why a lot of photographers use this paper is to prevent people from copying photos. So this is definitely a good lesson for you to understand why it's even existing. But in this case, obviously, this photo is so old that we won't be able to go back to that photographer and get a reprint. So we've got to figure out how to retouch what we can. So the next option is dust and scratches. And again, this sometimes, especially when you have a lot of dust and scratches, it might help soften any of the texture or scratches in the photo. Again, you've got different options here. And you'll just have to preview which one works best for you. The more you push it, the more it's going to basically blur that photo. So that's exaggerated just so you can see what it's doing to the photo. So I usually keep it pretty low, in between like 1 and 3 pixels. And then you can choose if that's enough for you. Usually just slightly softening it allows it to be softened enough to where that paper texture or that noise does not get in the way of you cloning as much as it did before you apply these. And then the last one is median, which they all kind of feel like the same thing, right? So it's essentially going to do almost the same. It's just going to soften that layer just a little bit. So you get to choose which one you feel works better for your image. I think all of those last 3 I saw just enough of a softening to that paper texture when I'm zoomed in that I can actually work with it. You just want to make sure that you don't push it so far that it looks like that. Okay, so usually it's going to be a pretty small number, somewhere between 1 and 3. And make sure when you zoom out, like, it still looks pretty crisp and clear to where we can figure out who is in the photo and actually see the photo clear enough. You don't want it to be so blurry that it makes your photo look a lot worse, but softening it just enough to where we don't have paper texture problems or noise problems is going to be a huge asset to you as you work in Photoshop retouching.